The champagne glass fell in slow motion, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Crystals shattered across the marble floor of Langford Tower's 58th floor ballroom, the sound slicing through the string quartet's gentle symphony. But the real fracture wasn't in the glass. It was in her. Amara Johnson stood frozen beneath a chandelier of golden glass as she watched William Langford, the man who'd promised forever, lean down and kiss Claire Ashford's exposed shoulder. The crowd laughed softly, oblivious, but Amara heard nothing. She only felt the cold rush of betrayal seeping through her veins like ice water. And right there, on the night when she thought she was stepping into her future, she watched it burn to ash. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, if you've ever seen someone you love become a stranger before your eyes, then you already know how this story begins. And if you want to follow how it ends, the way one woman turns heartbreak into power, stay with me. Like this story, share it, and follow along. Because this isn't just about love lost. It's about rising above everything that was meant to break you. The Sky Gala was supposed to be her night too. Amara had spent weeks preparing for this event. A shimmering parade of Chicago's wealthiest elite. The Langford Tower ballroom glittered with power. Suits pressed sharp as razors. Gowns floating like whispers. Billion-dollar deals sealed over champagne. She'd worn a silk emerald dress, a color William once said made her look like a storm about to break. Tonight, she was the storm. She just didn't know it yet. William stood across the room, as radiant and polished as the heir to the Langford Empire was expected to be. Tall, blonde, jawline cut from privilege, and beside him, Claire. Impossibly perfect Claire. Her gown clung like liquid silver. Her laugh was the kind people wrote sonnets about. Claire wasn't just another guest. She was Chicago's social royalty. Her family name opened doors Amara had spent her life fighting to even knock on. When William's eyes met hers across the crowd, they didn't carry warmth. No flicker of apology. No trace of the man who used to whisper that she was the only one who saw him, not his family's fortune. No. What stared back at her now was a glacial kind of indifference. A look that said, this was always inevitable. A gentle gasp rippled around her as the champagne flute hit the floor. She could feel the weight of every stare crawling across her skin. They weren't looking at her like a woman. They were looking at her like a spectacle. The scholarship girl who thought she belonged. The outsider who dared to dream too high. Amara turned and walked away. Not because she was weak, but because she refused to let them watch her break. Her heels struck the marble with sharp, deliberate precision, echoing down the hallway as she fled the golden ballroom. Beyond the ballroom doors, the night air of Chicago bit at her bare shoulders. She pressed a hand against her chest, as if she could hold herself together with sheer will. The city stretched out beneath her, Lake Michigan like a black mirror, the skyline burning with a million windows of someone else's dreams. She'd once believed that if she worked hard enough, she could claim a piece of it. But tonight, the city looked like it belonged entirely to people like William and Claire, and she was nothing more than an interloper who'd been politely, publicly removed. Inside, the gala music swelled. William was probably laughing. Claire was probably glowing. Their perfect world spun on, untouched. But out here, on the balcony, Amara's world had cracked wide open. She didn't know it yet, but this was the night that would turn a woman the world underestimated into someone it could no longer ignore. This wasn't just an ending, it was ignition. And if you've ever been told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Amara Johnson had grown up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the streetlights always seemed a little too dim and the sirens always came a little too late. The air carried the rhythm of survival, kids playing basketball on cracked pavement, corner stores with hand-painted signs, music spilling out of open windows in the summer heat. Her mother worked double shifts at St. Catherine's Hospital, and her father, a union mechanic, came home each night smelling like steel and sweat. They never had much, but they had each other, and they had belief. Her mother's favorite line was, "We don't have the keys, baby, so you've got to learn how to pick the locks." Amara carried those words like a talisman. While other kids memorized pop lyrics, she memorized scholarship requirements. While her friends mapped out summer jobs, she mapped out escape routes, routes that led to classrooms with polished floors, professors who wore blazers, and a world that didn't smell like diesel and fried chicken grease. She got there. Northwestern University, full scholarship. She arrived with a suitcase older than she was, a notebook filled with dreams, and the kind of hunger only those who've been denied can truly understand. On her first day, she noticed how easily the other students moved through that world. They belonged. She was only visiting. She never forgot the first time she met William Langford. He was standing under the bronze archway that crowned the quad, surrounded by people who looked like they were born to stand beneath monuments. He laughed in the easy way of someone who'd never had to worry about being heard. His shoes gleamed, his voice carried, and when his blue eyes met hers, Amara felt the kind of jolt that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with being seen by someone from the other side of the glass. Their first conversation was about a book, Baldwin of all things. He said he liked the way she spoke, like her words had been carved from somewhere deeper than most people ever went. She laughed because she didn't know what else to do. William Langford wasn't just a person, he was a door, and she'd spent her entire life learning how to open doors. But loving William was never simple. It wasn't the love itself that hurt, it was the translation it required. When she visited his world, she was expected to be grateful. The Langford mansion stretched along the lakefront, its ceilings taller than the entire floor of her family's home. The dinner conversations were a performance. Crystal glasses, forks she didn't know how to use, names she was supposed to recognize but didn't. They never said the words out loud, but the message hummed beneath every exchange. You're not one of us. His mother, Eleanor Langford, was elegance weaponized. Perfect posture, pearls that probably cost more than Amara's college tuition, and a smile that never touched her eyes. When she looked at Amara, it was like examining a designer bag she hadn't ordered. Something beautiful, perhaps, but out of place. At first, William shielded her from it, or maybe she just wanted to believe he did. He told her that love was enough, that he didn't care where she came from. And for a while, that lie was a soft place to land. But as the years passed, she noticed the subtle edges. The way his friends, heirs, bankers, trust fund babies, smiled when she spoke, as though she were a curious story, not a peer. The way William sometimes corrected the way she pronounced certain words. The way he hesitated when someone asked how they'd met. She worked 3 times as hard as anyone in their circle, just to keep her seat at the table. She climbed. God, she climbed. Every promotion, every award, every late night at the investment firm was another piece of armor. But armor gets heavy. The truth was cruel in its simplicity. While she was trying to earn her way in, everyone around her had been born inside. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to realize that their love existed in 2 different languages. In hers, it was a rebellion. In his, it was a charity. She remembered one night in particular, a fundraiser at the Langford estate. He had his arm around her waist as they greeted guests, and a man with silver hair leaned in and said with a smile, "So this is the scholarship girl. You must be proud of her, William. Not proud of us, not proud of her accomplishments, proud of owning something rare and exotic." William laughed it off. Amara didn't. On the drive home, she stared out the window as the lake blurred into black water, and she understood, maybe for the first time, that love wouldn't save her from class. Love might hold her hand at the gate, but it wouldn't get her inside. And yet, she stayed, because she believed in hard work, because she believed she could bridge the gap, because she thought that if she loved him fiercely enough and proved herself endlessly, eventually the world would have no choice but to accept her. But the world doesn't always reward belief. Sometimes, it just waits for the moment to remind you exactly where you came from. That reminder had come at the Sky Gala, but the roots of that humiliation had been planted years before, when Amara Johnson fell in love with a world that was never built to love her back. Snow pressed softly against the window of the cafe on Michigan Avenue, blurring the world outside into a smear of gray and white. Inside, the smell of roasted espresso clung to the air, warm and deceptive, as if kindness still existed here. Amara sat across from William Langford at a corner table. He'd chosen this cafe. He always chose the place, the time, the tone. It was the same corner where he'd first told her he loved her, the same corner where she'd once believed in forever. Now, his face was calm. Too calm. It was the kind of calm that comes when someone has already made up their mind and is only waiting for you to catch up. "Will," she whispered, though she didn't recognize the sound of her own voice. He didn't flinch. "Amara," he said, like her name was an obligation he needed to finish. "We need to be honest with each other." Her hands, resting on the ceramic mug, were cold. She'd walked here in the bitter wind, rehearsing 1,000 explanations for the Sky Gala, some impossible hope that what she'd seen was a mistake. But there was no script for this version of him. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if this conversation was an inconvenience. "I'm with Claire now." The words didn't land like a blow. They landed like a verdict. Clean, precise, final. Amara swallowed hard, the heat from her coffee doing nothing to stop the chill that climbed her spine. "Since when? Does it matter?" He tilted his head, the way he always did when he thought he was being rational. William loved being rational, loved making emotions sound like logistics. "It matters to me." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she saw the faintest flicker of discomfort, a tiny fracture in the armor of his certainty. "A few months. But Amara, you have to understand, Claire fits into my world in a way that you never really did." Her world tilted, but not because she hadn't expected it. She had. She'd seen the signs, the quiet pauses, the invisible walls closing in. This was just the moment when the door finally slammed shut. "I see," she said softly. William continued, because men like him always did. "You're smart, ambitious, everything I admired. But my life, it's not just mine. There are expectations, my family, my partners. Claire understands that. She's part of it." He didn't realize how cruel he sounded. Or maybe he did. Maybe cruelty was easier than guilt. "You mean," Amara said slowly, deliberately, "she was born into it." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them stretched, a taut thread ready to snap. Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent. Inside, everything she had spent years building around him, every compromise, every quiet swallowing of pride, cracked like old glass. "Do you remember," she said, her voice trembling, "when you told me you loved that I came from nothing, that I made my way here?" He shifted in his seat. "I meant it. But you don't want that woman at your side. You want a mirror, not a story." His lips parted, but no words came. Amara straightened her back, wrapping her fingers around the mug, though she no longer felt its warmth. She could taste the humiliation beneath her tongue, metallic and bitter. But beneath it, something colder was forming. Not despair, not even rage, something harder. A quiet, sharp clarity. William looked almost relieved when she didn't cry. He always hated mess. He liked things neat, especially endings. "I hope we can part as friends," he said. Friends. The word was almost funny. She stood up, slow and steady, like someone who had finally remembered who she was before the world tried to dress her in someone else's clothes. She adjusted her coat, her voice quiet but unwavering. "We were never equals in your world, William. But I'll make damn sure we are in mine." He blinked, startled, not because of the words themselves, but because she looked him in the eyes without pleading. Then she turned and walked out into the winter wind, her heels crunching against the slush. She didn't look back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Behind her, the cafe door closed with a soft chime that sounded like the end of something. Snow was falling harder now, thick and fast, swirling under the streetlights like ash. The city, cold and relentless, opened its arms to her again, not gently, but honestly. She pulled her coat tighter around her and whispered into the wind, "Let it end." Because endings, no matter how brutal, carry a pulse. The faint, steady heartbeat of something new waiting beneath the wreckage. The days that followed felt like a winter that wouldn't end. The city outside Amara's window carried on as if nothing had happened. Trains howling through the night, buses sighing at every stop, the streets glittering with a thin, bitter frost. But inside her apartment, the world had narrowed to shadows and silence. Her phone lay face down on the table, vibrating occasionally like a heartbeat she no longer trusted. Every time she thought about picking it up, she imagined the headlines in her social feed. William and Claire. Claire and William, their smiles captured under golden chandeliers, their faces glowing as if betrayal was simply another kind of spotlight. She couldn't look. Not yet. She didn't go to work for 3 days. The woman who had once walked into meetings with the sharpness of a blade now stayed in bed until the sun dipped beneath the skyline. She lived off black coffee and whatever was left in her fridge. Sleep came in fractured pieces. Grief didn't arrive like a storm. It settled like fog, thick and relentless, clinging to everything she touched. On the 4th morning, she sat by the window wrapped in the coat she hadn't taken off the night William ended it. Snow drifted past the glass, lazy and indifferent. Down below, Chicago pulsed with people chasing their dreams, arguing over coffee, rushing into lives that weren't hers anymore. Her own reflection in the glass startled her. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The news spread through the investment world faster than she could silence it. William Langford, the Golden Boy, was officially with Claire Ashford. Photos from the Sky Gala flooded finance blogs, society pages, gossip accounts. Claire's silver dress, William's perfect smile, a caption that burned like acid in her throat. A match made in Chicago high society. At the firm, no one said anything to her directly, but the air around her changed. Colleagues who once hovered at her desk now turned away in elevators. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. She became a living cautionary tale, the ambitious outsider who reached too high and fell hard. The Langford family had been a cornerstone client. Everyone knew it. Her promotions, her connections, the deals she closed, they'd all carried the shadow of William's name. And now that name had shut its doors on her. Clients began quietly transferring accounts, not because she'd failed at her job, but because people with power could erase someone with silence. One afternoon, she passed by 2 associates in the hallway. They didn't lower their voices. "It's sad, really," one of them whispered. She thought she was going to be one of them. "Yeah," the other laughed softly. Claire was always the better fit. The words didn't break her. They hollowed her out. That night, she came home to the apartment she'd once been proud of. Her heels echoed against the hardwood floor as if mocking her. She dropped her purse on the counter and sat on the floor, knees to her chest, the silence pressing in. It wasn't the loss of William that crushed her. It was the way the world around him had erased her so effortlessly, as if she'd never mattered at all. Danielle showed up unannounced on the 5th night. She was Amara's oldest friend, the one who'd known her before the designer dresses and black tie galas. She took one look at Amara and said, "You look like hell." Amara managed a hoarse laugh. "Thanks." "No, I mean it," Danielle said, kicking off her boots and stepping inside. "When was the last time you showered? Ate something real? The world doesn't get to take everything from you, Amara." Amara stared at the floor. It already did. Danielle crouched down in front of her, gripping her cold hands. "No, William did. His world did. But that's not everything." Amara wanted to believe her, but she could still hear the whispers at work, still feel the stares at the grocery store, still picture Claire's smile, bright and flawless, the way people looked at her like she was exactly where she belonged. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I don't know who I am without him." Danielle's voice softened. "Then maybe it's time to remember who you were before him." The city roared faintly outside. Cars, wind, life. And for the first time in days, Amara blinked back the fog just enough to let a single thought slip through. The world had burned around her, but she was still breathing in the ashes. It wasn't strength yet. It wasn't hope. Just a pulse. A reminder. Something inside her hadn't died. Not completely. But for now, she sat there, in the quiet wreckage of her old life, knowing that the only way forward would be built from the ruins. The morning she decided to rise didn't arrive with trumpets. It came with the sound of her radiator ticking in the cold, and a rectangle of pale light crawling across the floorboards. Amara sat on the edge of her bed, fingers laced, listening to the hush of the city before it warmed to its noise. The ache was still there, tender, livid, but it had changed shape. Grief had burned down to a clean, hard ember. She stood, opened every window, and let winter air rush through the rooms. The first thing she did was gather the remnants of a life that was no longer hers. The gala program, the cufflink left in a drawer, the smiling photos that had seemed like proof. She fed them to a metal trash can in the kitchen sink and struck a match. The paper curled, blackened, and surrendered. After the smoke cleared, she cleaned, not to erase him, but to make space for herself. She scrubbed the counters until they gleamed, shook grit from the rug, wiped the mirror. When she looked up, a woman stared back whose eyes were tired but awake. There was a simplicity to the moment that felt like truth. No miracles, no promises, just decision. She laced her sneakers and ran. Out of Bronzeville, up toward the lake, into wind that bit her lungs and made her feel gloriously, savagely alive. The skyline cut a clean edge against a white sky. Lake Michigan was a slate of winter steel. Each footfall on the path was a small refusal. No to pity, no to silence, no to being written out of rooms she had fought to enter. By the time she reached the museum steps, her pulse had steadied into a drumbeat. She spoke into the wind, not as a plea, but as a vow. We build from what tried to break us. Back home, she spread documents across her table like a war map. Grid capacity studies, state incentives, municipal RFPs, brownfield restoration proposals, school district rooftop pilots, wind corridors charted like arteries across the Great Lakes. She had been tracking the numbers for months, even through heartbreak, reflex more than hope. Chicago's old money ignored these plays because they lacked chandeliers. But the returns were there, patient and factual, waiting for someone unafraid of work without applause. She drafted the pitch deck with a precision that felt like prayer. Slide by slide, she built the case. Undervalued assets in legacy manufacturing towns, public-private structures that spread risk, community ownership tranches that stabilized cash flow, a pipeline of startups solving last-mile storage and grid flexibility. Every chart was an argument. Every footnote, a quiet dare. She named the strategy South Wind, after the current that moves beneath the lake where no one can see it. At noon, Danielle arrived with soup and a look that said she would fight anyone who hurt Amara and also make them tea. She listened as Amara outlined the plan, head tilted, eyes brightening in increments. "This isn't a comeback," Danielle said finally. "It's a redefinition." "Or a very elegant way to get fired," Amara said, and they both smiled because it was possibly true. She sent the email to the partners before she could second-guess it. Concise, confident, unflinching. "I'm requesting 20 minutes with investment committee to present a regional clean energy strategy. Underserved markets, superior unit economics. You're leaving money on the table because it isn't lit by chandeliers." She hovered over send, then pressed it and sat very still, as if she could hear the message cross the city, slip beneath doors, and unfold itself at mahogany desks. The reply came faster than she expected. A calendar invite. Conference room 21B, 20 minutes, tomorrow morning. The subject line read only, Proposal, Johnson. She exhaled like she had been holding her breath since the cafe. That night she rehearsed, not the words, they were carved into her, but the silences around them. She practiced looking at men who thought her ambition was a costume and letting the silence say, "I'm not asking permission." She revised the deck until her eyes blurred, then closed her laptop and sat on the floor, spine against the couch, palms open on her knees. The city hummed through the walls. She thought of her mother's line, "We don't have the keys, baby. Learn to pick the locks," and realized she'd been picking the wrong doors. This time, she would build one. Morning arrived clear and sharp. She dressed with intention. Black suit, no apology. She braided her hair close to her scalp, a crown that said she belonged to herself. On the train downtown, she watched her reflection tremble against the tunnel glass, not as fragility, but as acceleration. When she stepped into the lobby, she could feel the rooms arranging themselves around their old assumptions. She refused to fit. Conference room 21B smelled like citrus and money. The partners were already seated, jackets crisp, tablets aligned. Their faces held the boredom of men who believed they'd seen everything worth seeing. Gerald, her direct supervisor, glanced up with a warning in his eyes she chose not to understand. She connected her laptop, and the first slide lit the screen. South Wind, capturing the returns everyone's too polite to see. Amara didn't clear her throat. She didn't preface. She didn't apologize for the 20 minutes she intended to earn. "You're mispricing risk," she began, voice steady. "Not because the numbers are unclear, but because the narrative is. You fund spectacle. I'm offering substance. Here's the delta." She moved through capacity maps and revenue stacks, not as if she were pleading for belief, but as if belief were inevitable. She showed the edge cases and the guardrails, the political wins and how to sail them, the communities that would co-own their own light. She laid out a timetable that was aggressive but defensible. And then she did something no one expected. She named the moral alongside the math. When you invest where the lights are dim, you are not doing charity. You are choosing underestimated markets over overestimated egos. The return profile reflects that. Silence. The good kind. The kind that meant she had made them think past their reflexes. A partner with silver hair drummed his fingers once against the table. Another adjusted his glasses and scrolled through the appendix. Gerald watched her like a man waiting for a sky to fall that stubbornly refused to. "Ambitious," Silverhair said at last. It wasn't an insult, and it wasn't praise. It was a weight thrown into a scale to see how much she could carry. Amara met his gaze. "Correct." He leaned back. "And if you're wrong, then I'm the one who bears it," she said. "Allocate a pilot tranche. Ring-fence it. Hold me to public milestones. If I miss them, you'll have your precedent for being cautious forever. If I hit them, we stop mistaking chandeliers for due diligence." The room breathed. Somewhere below, a siren stitched the winter air. Amara didn't fill the quiet. She had learned the discipline of letting truth take up space. Finally, the chair of the committee closed his tablet. 20 minutes well used, Miss Johnson." A pause. "We'll confer." She gathered her laptop. Fingerprints ghosted on the lid, heartbeat steady. At the door, she looked back. Not to ask, not to beg, only to mark the border she had just crossed. Outside the conference room, the hall felt brighter. Or maybe it was just her. She walked past the window wall and saw the lake cutting a cold band across the city, indifferent and eternal. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a flare in the dark, clean and undeniable. The first spark. The decision, made and kept. And somewhere beneath the polished floors of this building, a current shifted direction. Quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. The rooftop bar glimmered like a secret hidden above the city. Golden light spilled over steel and glass, and the night air carried that sharp, electric chill unique to Chicago in late winter. The kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. Amara paused at the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the soft amber glow. Down below, the city roared. Up here, power hummed quietly between polished glasses and quiet conversations. She hadn't wanted to come. Networking events were where William's world had always seemed to stretch its long fingers, polite, perfumed, and ready to remind her she didn't belong. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't someone's plus one. She wasn't the woman who'd been discarded. She was the woman with a pitch that had made a room full of men in tailored suits lean forward. And that woman had to be here. Danielle's voice still echoed in her head. "If you want the future, you can't wait for it to knock. You crash the door." She took a steadying breath, smoothing the lapel of her black blazer, and stepped into the crowd. The room was a map of money. Venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, founders with billion-dollar startups dressed like they'd just rolled out of bed. Everyone scanning, calculating, deciding who was worth their time. She moved like she belonged there, because she'd decided she did. It was near the window, framed by the halo of the skyline, that she saw him. Nathaniel Whitmore. Even among sharks, he stood out. He wasn't the kind of rich that wrapped itself in old family crests like William. Nate was new money, the kind that had been forged rather than inherited. He'd built his first company out of a borrowed garage and sold it before 30. Now, every article about him used words like disruptive and infuriating. William used other words, none of them kind. Nate had that quiet gravity that didn't need to announce itself. He stood with a glass of whiskey in hand, listening to someone with a kind of focus that made people lean toward him without realizing it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that fell just slightly out of place, He looked like someone who didn't mind bending the world to fit him. William had hated him for years, not because Nate had done anything to him personally, but because he represented everything William despised. Merit over legacy, new blood outpacing old money, someone who didn't ask permission to exist. And now, Amara was walking toward him. She didn't think. She just moved, weaving through the clusters of suits and sparkling dresses until she stood near enough to catch the glint in his blue-gray eyes when he noticed her. "Mr. Whitmore," she said evenly, as if introducing herself to men like him was something she did every night. His gaze sharpened, and the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile exactly, but something close. "Guilty," he replied. His voice carried the calm weight of someone who had no need to prove anything. "And you are?" "Amara Johnson," she said, "investment strategist at Sterling and Hayes." He raised a brow, as if filing the name somewhere. "I know that name." She tilted her head, matching his composure. "Good. Then I can skip the small talk." That earned her a low, genuine laugh. Bold. I like bold. The group he'd been talking to melted away the moment she held his attention. That was power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that rearranges a room without lifting a finger. Amara didn't waste time. "I'm building a strategy focused on clean energy transitions in the Midwest," she said, her voice firm but alive. "Not the shiny stuff. The overlooked, undervalued infrastructure that actually holds the grid together. It's risky. It's also where the returns are hiding." Most people would have interrupted. Nate didn't. He let her speak, and when she finished, he looked at her the way a chess player looks at a board mid-game. Not dismissing, but studying. "Sterling doesn't do high-volatility plays," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "they don't. I do." For a second, the air between them tightened, charged, but quiet. Then he leaned slightly closer, curiosity glinting like a blade catching light. "You know, William Langford once told me you were too idealistic to last in real finance." Her pulse flickered, but her face didn't. "And you believed him?" "I don't believe people who inherited their opinions," Nate said. The corner of her mouth lifted. "Good." Someone called his name across the room, but he didn't look away. "You know," he said, "pitching me at a crowded event like this takes either nerve or desperation." Amara met his gaze head-on. Maybe both. That was the moment something shifted. Not loud or cinematic, but like a current changing direction deep under the surface. He took a slow sip of his drink, then held out a card. "Send me the deck," he said, "and let's see if you're as good as you sound." Their fingers didn't touch, but the exchange felt electric. She slipped the card into her pocket without looking down. "You'll want to read it twice," she said. He laughed again, lower this time, real. "I have a feeling I will." As she walked away, the night seemed to breathe with her. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like loss. It tasted like possibility, sharp, clean, a little dangerous. Below the rooftop, Chicago stretched out in endless lights. Above, the sky was dark enough to swallow whole histories. And somewhere out there, William Langford was probably enjoying his perfect life with Claire. He had no idea the one woman he'd dismissed had just made an ally out of the man he hated most. And that was exactly how revolutions begin, not with applause, but with a single, deliberate step toward the enemy of the world that broke you. The following week was a lesson in how fast walls could close in. The ink on the meeting notes from her pitch was barely dry when the pushback began. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet hum of power deciding she wasn't to be taken seriously. When Amara stepped into the Sterling and Hayes boardroom that Monday, she could already feel the temperature in the air. The senior partners had their polite faces on, the kind that meant the real decisions had already been made somewhere else. Gerald, her supervisor, gave her a tight smile. It wasn't encouragement, it was caution. She connected her laptop, projecting the updated Southwind proposal. The numbers were clean, the model watertight. "Your model assumes high stability across Midwest infrastructure," said one of the partners, tapping his pen against the table like a metronome. "That's optimistic." "Not optimistic," Amara replied, steady but controlled. "Backed by existing grid performance reports and state-level funding packages. It's low glamour, high predictability investment." The partner didn't respond to her data. He smiled, thin and soft, the kind that always preceded dismissal. It's just not where this firm plays, Miss Johnson. Not where this firm plays. It wasn't the first time she'd heard that phrase. It was how Sterling and Hayes politely said, "We don't bet on people like you." Another partner, hair silver, leaned back in his chair. "Our clients prefer visibility. They want to be associated with the skyline, big towers, named projects, not grain elevators in Ohio." Amara's throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. With respect, grain elevators in Ohio are currently generating more reliable revenue than 3 of your last 5 skyline projects. Silence. Then a low chuckle from someone at the far end of the table. Not malicious, worse, amused. She'd walked into this meeting prepared for a fight. She hadn't prepared for condescension dressed up as civility. "We're not saying no," Gerald added quickly, looking at her like he was already trying to protect his job. "But it's an unconventional proposal. Maybe too aggressive for our current strategy." Amara closed her laptop with deliberate calm. "It's not aggressive," she said. "It's smart. And it's exactly where the next wave of growth is going to happen. You'll either be early or you'll be irrelevant." She left the room to the sound of the chair clearing his throat. An ending, not a beginning. In the elevator, her hands trembled, not from fear but from fury so sharp it almost tasted metallic. It wasn't that they doubted the numbers. They doubted her. By noon, whispers had started. She heard them as she passed the open kitchen, as she stood by the espresso machine. "She's really pushing this rural energy thing. She doesn't understand how this firm works. She's talented, sure, but ambitious in the wrong direction." It was the same music she'd heard her entire career, just in different keys. When her inbox pinged that afternoon, she already knew what the message would say. Subject: Southwind proposal. "Thank you for the presentation. The partners have decided not to proceed with internal funding at this time. Should you wish to pursue this independently, the firm cannot allocate resources." Gerald. It was dressed in corporate language, but it meant one thing: "We don't believe in you." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the city. For a brief moment, the old ache returned, the one from the Sky Gala, from the cafe, from all the doors that had closed in her face. But beneath that ache, something else burned brighter. She'd already expected this. Men like them didn't follow until someone else built the path. She opened her notebook, flipping past the neat bullet points of her corporate life, past the careful plans designed to keep everyone comfortable. She stopped on a blank page. At the top, she wrote 2 words: Plan B. She started listing every contact she'd made outside the firm: regional banks, clean tech startups, municipal leaders who'd seen what she'd seen. Names that had never been invited to sit at Sterling's polished mahogany tables. And one more name: Nathaniel Whitmore. She remembered his words on the rooftop. "Pitching me at a crowded event like this takes either nerve or desperation." Well, nerve was all she had left. If the firm wouldn't back her, she'd find someone who would. And if they thought her idea was beneath their skyline, then she would build something that made their towers look small. As night draped itself over the city, Amara switched off her office light and walked out, not defeated, but recalibrated. The elevator reflected her face back at her, sharp, tired, alive. It was her first real setback since deciding to rise. But it was also the first time she realized something important. She didn't need their permission. She needed their underestimation, because underestimation wasn't a wall. It was cover, and under cover, revolutions grow quietly. The Langford wedding unfolded like a scene designed to remind people where they belonged. The cathedral's vaulted ceiling gathered candlelight into a soft golden haze. White roses crowned every column. A string quartet threaded Vivaldi through the hush of old money holding its breath. Amara stood near the back beneath a stained glass window, invisible by design, the invitation heavy in her clutch like a dare she had accepted. Danielle had begged her not to come, but Amara had understood something Danielle didn't. Sometimes survival required looking the story in the eye and refusing to blink. Claire arrived in a spill of silk and stardust, the aisle blooming in her wake. Cameras didn't flash here. They observed, discreet and reverent, because rules were different when the powerful performed their rituals. William waited at the altar, chin lifted, jaw set, the very picture of a future drafted by committees. When his gaze drifted across the pews and skated past Amara without stopping, she felt the old ache loosen, then fall away like a coat she'd outgrown. The vows were exquisite and empty, promises spoken in perfect diction, laughter at the appointed places. The ring slid onto Claire's finger with all the finality of a door closing that had never been hers to open. Applause rose in gentle waves, and then the cathedral exhaled. The reception unfolded at the Langford estate, a mansion along the lake where the windows held the winter sky like crystal bowls. Champagne moved like a second bloodstream through the rooms. Portraits of ancestors watched from their gilded frames, approving a continuity that had never been in doubt. Amara crossed the marble foyer with the steady poise of a woman who had learned to balance grief on high heels. Every surface gleamed, every conversation curated itself to exclude her. Amara. The voice was smooth, lacquered. Eleanor Langford stood at the edge of the ballroom in a column of ivory silk, pearls resting at her throat like punctuation. Her smile was the kind that left no fingerprints. "How lovely that you could join us." "Congratulations," Amara said evenly. "You must be proud." "Pride is such a delicate thing," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. "One tries to invest it wisely, for example in unions that make sense." Her eyes held the glint of a scalpel. "You're very accomplished, my dear. We all admired your tenacity. But a family like ours must consider the long view." "The long view," Amara repeated, tasting the words. "You mean the view from the top?" "Exactly." Eleanor's gaze flicked over Amara's dress, her hair, the quiet steadiness in her spine, as though taking inventory of an item that had failed quality control. "I'm sure you understand. We each have our proper stage." Amara let the silence stretch, let the string quartet's lilting brightness float between them like a dare. Then she smiled, not sweetly, not sorrowfully, but like someone aligning a sightline. "I do understand," she said, "and I'm done auditioning for yours." Eleanor's smile thinned by a fraction. "Careful, dear. Bitterness rarely flatters." "This isn't bitterness," Amara said, voice low and precise. "It's clarity. I spent years speaking your language, learning your forks, laughing at your jokes. I mistook translation for belonging. That was my error, not yours." She angled her head, respectful as a bow, sharp as a blade. "Keep your stage. I'll build the theater." A tremor passed through Eleanor's composure, there and gone. "I do hope you find success," she said, as if the word were breakable. "I already have." Amara stepped away before courtesy could transmute into insult. The quartet arced into a bright refrain. Laughter frothed near the dance floor. The room continued without her. She reached the terrace for air. The lake had turned to hammered pewter under the winter sky. The city was a crown of ice along the horizon. Footsteps sounded behind her. She didn't turn until the familiar baritone came, dry and amused. "I was told there'd be fireworks," Nathaniel Whitmore said, "but this is better." He stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, unbothered by the cold or the constellation of eyes that would object to his presence here. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered context. "Langford Sr. invested a token check in one of my early companies. I'm here to pay a debt that's already paid." Amara huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "And to watch the spectacle." "Maybe." He studied her profile, the steadiness there. "You handled Eleanor like a surgeon." "I'm tired of apologizing for my pulse," she said, eyes on the dark water. "And I'm done mistaking their chandeliers for proof." He nodded as if confirming a calculation. "I read your deck. Twice a beat. You're early. That's the best kind of right." She turned then, the wind tugging at a strand of hair she didn't bother to smooth. "Early is lonely. Not if you pick your company." He paused, measuring the risk in the offer he was about to make, as if risk were a language they both preferred. "Dinner, tomorrow. We'll talk Southwind, and we won't whisper." For a heartbeat, the night seemed to lean toward them. Somewhere inside, applause rose again, muffled by glass and distance. Amara felt the sound pass through her like weather that no longer applied. "Tomorrow," she said. They returned to the ballroom separately. She crossed behind a lattice of winter florals, past a table where a silver-haired donor was telling a story he had told for 30 years. William and Claire were waltzing beneath the chandelier, a perfect rotation of image and inevitability. William looked momentarily toward the terrace, as if expecting to find a shadow from which he'd already been delivered. He didn't see her. This time, he wasn't supposed to. Danielle found Amara near the coat check, eyes bright with the kind of relief that lives just this side of fury. "You okay?" Amara slid her gloves on, each finger a small act of order. "Better than okay." They stepped into the night. Snow was beginning again, quiet, deliberate, an annotation on the city's hard lines. Behind her, laughter ricocheted off marble. Ahead, Michigan Avenue unfurled like a runway carved from ice. She did not feel triumphant. She felt accurate. The wedding would be beautiful in photographs, anchored forever in magazines that curated lineage and light. None of those pages would show a woman on a terrace choosing a different axis for her life. None would print the moment a dynasty underestimated the wrong person. Amara walked toward the street as though the ground were rising to meet her. Somewhere far across the lake, wind turbines turned. Slow, patient, certain. Translating weather into power no chandelier could claim. The first bet wasn't made in a boardroom. It was made in a drafty warehouse on the Detroit River, where the wind rattled the tin roof like a drum. Amara stood with a hard hat tucked under her arm, her breath ghosting in the cold, listening to two founders sketch a grid on a grease-stained whiteboard. They weren't pretty, they weren't polished, but they were the kind of people who measured things in megawatts and months instead of cocktail hours. "This corridor will carry 9 turbines, one of them said, thick gloves pointing to a map pocked with red pins. "Average capacity factor's better than the model. The problem's financing. Everyone wants the glossy stuff by the lakefront. No one wants this." "I do," Amara said, and she meant it. She could feel the old ache, clean now, not raw, transmute into something visionary and stubborn. She had spent years learning to read the room. Now she was learning to read the wind. Due diligence became a ritual. She drove icy highways like rosary beads, county to county, gathering approvals and rejections in equal measure. She sat across from a union steward who tested her with silence for 10 full minutes before he finally said, "You bring jobs that last, not lay off," headlines, "and we'll put our shoulders under it." She met a school superintendent who wanted rooftop solar but had been told it was too complicated, and a retired farmer who signed his parcel with a shaking hand and a smile that looked like relief. At night, she spread spreadsheets across her kitchen table until they looked like constellations. She built covenants into a term sheet like ribs, milestone triggers, clawbacks, community profit sharing. She called regional banks, insurers, 3 philanthropic funds with climate mandates. She heard too early, too niche, too risky. So many times the syllables lost their edges. Each no filed itself under the same heading. "Not you." Nate called after midnight from an airport lounge that sounded like glass. "Walk me through the cap stack again," he said. He wasn't offering reassurance. He was offering rigor, his version of respect. She paced in socked feet, the city humming outside, and laid it out. Public credits at the base, senior debt, a slim layer of mezz, and her equity at the top, exposed, honest, deliberate. "You're overexposed," he said. "I'm committed," she answered. A pause, then the faintest smile in his voice. "Send me the revised term sheet. I won't put money in yet, but I'll anchor a vendor line with my name if you hit your first permit window." It wasn't capital. It was something rarer, a bridge built out of reputation. She liquidated her savings with a click that felt like jumping off a cliff. High-yield account, the emergency fund, the 401k rollover she had promised to let sit and grow quietly into a future that no longer existed. The numbers slid from black to 0 on the banking app. The screen went momentarily gray, as if even the pixels understood what she'd done. She wired her first tranche at 5:42 a.m., the city black, blue, and tender, her hand steady. There had been a time when she believed security was the goal. Turns out, it was traction. Word traveled faster than contracts. A boutique finance blog ran a paragraph that smelled like condescension. Former Langford companion places personal funds into rural wind. Romantic, if unwise. A glossy magazine ran a spread of William and Claire opening an arts pavilion. Legacy meets love. The algorithm pushed both to her phone in the same hour. She turned the phone face down and returned to her models. At Sterling and Hayes, the temperature dropped 10 degrees when she entered a room. Gerald closed his office door and tried for gentle. If this goes south, Amara, it won't just be a bad quarter. It'll be a story. It already is, she said not unkindly. I'm just changing the ending. The founders texted a photo of a permit clerk stamping a form with a comically large seal. One down. Another message followed with a grainy video of a county board vote. 7 ayes, 2 nays, a smattering of applause, and someone coughing like a period at the end of a sentence. Then the snag. A transmission easement held by a shell company that existed only to extract delay. The kind of invisible snare old money specialized in. No fingerprints, only friction. Weeks compressed into email threads and terse calls. A lawyer in a low building off the freeway told her, "They're running out the clock on your winter window." She drove out anyway. The land was flat and wide, the sky a hard enamel of February. She stood with the founders at the property line where the easement choked the plan to a halt. Wind tore at her collar. The map on the clipboard snapped like a flag. "We redesign," she said, tracing a new arc with her finger, moving 2 turbines, adding a storage container, bracing the budget with pain she could quantify. "We bleed now, not later." They rebuilt the model in a diner that smelled like coffee and maple syrup. Numbers jostled, then settled. The IRR narrowed, but the runway cleared. She sent the revision to Nate with a single line. "I accepted the constraint and preserved the thesis." His reply came 8 minutes later. "Then you have my name on the vendor line. Don't make me regret it." Chicago thawed by degrees. On a wet March morning, Amara watched as a crane lifted the first nacelle into the air, a pale giant turning slowly like a planet finding its orbit. The men on the ground moved with the crisp choreography of competence, and for a moment, the noise of her life receded. It was just wind and steel and math. Her mother called that evening. They didn't talk about William or Claire. They talked about weather and recipes and the kind of small tenderness that keeps people from cracking. At the end, her mother said, "You sound like yourself again." She didn't sleep much, but when she did, she dreamed of lines, power lines, supply lines, lifelines, all of them tightening into a net she wove with her own hands. A final hurdle loomed, the State Energy Commission's approval for interconnection. A vote that would either crown her first bet or cut it off at the ankle. The agenda was public, so were the lobbyists. She knew which families had interests on the other side. She wore her black suit in a steady breath and spoke for exactly 6 minutes. No romance, no apology, just the truth of electrons and cash flow and communities that wanted their lights to belong to them. When she stepped out into the hallway, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Then a second. She opened the first and saw a still image. William on a dais, ribbon in hand, Claire shining beside him. Legacy meets love. Again. She opened the second and stared, long enough for the noise of the building to fade. It was a calendar reminder from the commission's clerk. Decision at 9 a.m., Friday. 3 days. Amara pocketed the phone and looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the lobby. Not the scholarship girl who'd learned their forks. Not the woman erased by the Sky Gala. Someone else. Someone who had wired her last dollar into a bet the city didn't understand yet. On the ride down, the elevator hummed, a low note that felt like a held breath. When the doors opened, the day broke across her face. Wind clean, sky merciless, lake alive. The first turbine would spin soon. Or it wouldn't. But the bet had been placed. Not at their table, not with their rules. And for the first time, the outcome felt less like fate and more like physics. What you build either holds or it doesn't. The rest is noise. The morning of the vote broke clean and sharp. Chicago's lakefront was wrapped in a pale silver mist, the kind that made the skyline look like it was hovering. Amara sat in the corridor outside the Illinois State Energy Commission chamber, hands resting loosely on her lap. She'd been here before, not this building, but this kind of moment. The space between everything she had risked and everything she might become. A security guard walked past. Lawyers in suits too expensive to wrinkle exchanged quiet, practiced smiles. On the other side of the hallway, a man in a wool coat, an energy lobbyist whose last name was older than most counties, looked at her the way people look at someone who's wandered too close to a gate they're not supposed to open. 3 months ago, she would have shrunk beneath that stare. Now, she simply returned it, steady, unflinching, unbothered. The door to the chamber opened. "Ms. Johnson," the clerk called. "They're ready." The room wasn't large, but it held the kind of power that could shape entire economies. 8 commissioners sat behind a raised desk. Behind them, state and municipal flags stood like quiet witnesses. Representatives from utilities and private energy conglomerates filled the gallery. Their suits carried a subtle scent of entitlement, polished to a shine. Amara walked to the podium. Her black suit felt less like armor now and more like skin. She'd worn it so often these past months, it had absorbed her pulse. One of the commissioners adjusted his glasses. "Miss Johnson, you have 5 minutes to make your final statement." She nodded once. 5 minutes is more than enough. She didn't give them poetry. She gave them facts sharpened to a blade. She spoke of the grid corridor she'd mapped with her own hands, of the job numbers and tax revenue projections the big firms had dismissed as too small to matter. She told them about the school district that had signed a rooftop solar agreement because no one else had bothered to ask. And then she looked them in the eye one by one. "This isn't about building monuments," she said softly. "It's about power, real working power. The kind that doesn't shine in magazines, but keeps towns alive when the wind turns and the winter comes. If you're waiting for someone bigger to believe in this first, you'll be waiting forever. I'm already here." The words landed in the room like a clean strike on metal. No theatrics, no tremor, just clarity. When she finished, the chair of the commission nodded. "Thank you, Miss Johnson." She stepped back, pulse a steady drum. The vote began. One by one, hands lifted. 5 in favor, 6, 7. She barely heard the 8th because the room blurred. Not from shock, but from the sheer force of relief cutting through the cold. 7 votes. Approval. Interconnection granted. The lobbyists in the corner murmured, already recalculating. She walked out of the chamber into the crisp morning, her lungs filling with air that tasted like steel and snow. She didn't smile. She inhaled. Deeply. The turbine site was already buzzing by the time she arrived that afternoon. Trucks rumbled over frozen ground. Men in orange vests shouted over the roar of machinery. The first nacelle was upright now, white against a sky the color of gunmetal. One blade was already spinning. Slowly, then steadily. Wind caught steel. Steel answered. The sound wasn't loud. It was low and constant, a hum that lived in your bones. She tilted her head back to watch it turn, breath catching in her throat. This was what belief looked like when it became infrastructure. Not applause, not a headline. A machine doing what it was built to do. One of the founders approached her, helmet crooked, cheeks flushed from the cold. "You did it." "We did it," she corrected. The first checks cleared 3 weeks later. State incentives unlocked. Local media picked up the story, then a regional business column. They called it an unexpected player in the clean energy boom. They called her the outsider who bet against the skyline. Sterling and Hayes didn't call it anything, not at first. But people noticed. Colleagues who'd once walked past her without meeting her eyes now paused in the hallway. Gerald appeared at her office door one morning, voice careful, too neutral to be honest. "The partners would like to understand your structure, for future reference." She almost laughed. Not at him, but at the quiet predictability of power. They always followed when the proof arrived in numbers. The first deal was small by their standards, barely a blip in the billion-dollar portfolios that filled the glass towers of downtown. But it wasn't about size. It was about trajectory. Amara visited the site again in early April. The snow was gone, replaced by damp earth and the scent of thaw. The wind turbines rose from the flatland like white giants, slow and deliberate. The workers nodded when she walked by, not as a stranger, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She climbed the maintenance ladder halfway up the tower, her hands cold against the metal, and stopped on the landing. The fields stretched endlessly around her. For years, her view of success had been the Langford Ballroom, the skyline reflecting in crystal. But this wide open horizon was cleaner, truer. Her phone buzzed. A message from Nate. The world noticed. You've got sharks circling. Congratulations. Let them circle, she typed back. I've already built the current. As the blade spun above her, something settled inside. Not the brittle kind of triumph she used to chase. Something quieter, stronger. She hadn't just survived the storm. She had harnessed it. Across the state line, William and Claire were in some magazine again, wrapped in light that looked like a fairy tale. But their world, polished, pre-written, felt small now, distant. She didn't need to outshine it. She'd outgrown it. The first wind farm wasn't an ending. It was proof. A door she'd built herself. And this time, she held the key. Amara had learning that victory didn't arrive with fanfare. It came as a quiet shift in the air, like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside the world. Southwind's first success had set off ripples she could feel in every room she entered. Investors who once smiled at her like a novelty now measured their words carefully. Journalists wanted interviews. Former colleagues who used to avoid her gaze in the elevator now lingered, asking about opportunities. But beneath the noise, something steadier was building. Something that had nothing to do with headlines or balance sheets. It started with Nate showing up unannounced at the project site on a wind-bitten April afternoon. He wore a wool coat that didn't match the mud caked to his boots, but he didn't complain. He just stood at the base of a turbine, hands in his pockets, watching the blades turn. "Looks better in real life," he said. Amara laughed softly. "I told you numbers can't do wind justice." "Numbers can do everything justice," he countered. Then after a beat, "But sometimes, maybe not." Their partnership began with the logic of shared ambition. Nate believed in numbers the way she believed in momentum. Cold, clean, indisputable. But he also believed in her, which was rarer. They started talking more, not just at industry events or late-night calls to fine-tune a financial model, but in stolen hours between meetings, at quiet cafes, on long drives to rural counties where no one cared about last names. When the opportunity for a new, much bigger project surfaced, a solar-wind hybrid plant spanning 2 states, he didn't pitch her. He asked her to co-lead. "We don't need another Titan," he'd said simply. "We need something built right." The project became their shared heartbeat. Days blurred into strategy sessions where ideas sparked like live wires between them. He'd challenge her assumptions without diminishing her. She'd sharpen his instincts without dimming his. It was a rare, startling balance. No pedestal, no shadow. Just 2 people building something that could outlast both of them. The night it happened, they had just come out of a pitch that no one expected them to win. It was a closed-door session with a room full of hard, skeptical capital. People who were born on third base and spent their lives pretending they hit a triple. They'd walked in with nothing but data and grit. They'd walked out with a handshake and a commitment that would triple Southwind's footprint overnight. The city felt different that night. Rain glossed the streets, turning traffic lights into blurred constellations. They ducked under the awning of a quiet wine bar, shoulders damp, adrenaline still sharp in their blood. "You know," Nate said, shaking the rain from his hair, "I've closed bigger deals." Amara arched a brow. "Then why do you look like you just won the Super Bowl?" "Because I've never closed one that mattered this much." For a moment, they stood in the hush between passing cars and rain. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded filling. It held its own weight, clean and certain. Nate's hand brushed against hers. Not a grab, not a claim. A quiet question. She didn't pull away. They'd spent months orbiting each other, professionally aligned, emotionally cautious. But tonight the air felt charged, like the pause before lightning finds the tallest point. She stepped closer without meaning to. Or maybe she'd been meaning to all along. When he kissed her, it wasn't soft or hesitant. It was steady, as if every hour spent fighting for a future they hadn't yet named had led exactly here. His hands slid to the back of her neck, warm against skin still cool from the rain. Her fingers curled into his lapel, grounding herself in something that felt terrifyingly real. She wasn't lost in the moment. She was entirely present. When they finally parted, the sound of rain filled the space between their breaths. Nate's smile was quiet, almost reverent. "Well," he said, "I guess that answers the question." Amara tilted her head. "What question?" "Whether 2 people can build an empire and still feel like this." Her laugh was soft, low. We're just getting started. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, deliberate crescendo. Their relationship wasn't a whirlwind. It was a structure, built with the same precision they used for every turbine, every wire, every line item. They didn't let the world define what they were. They defined it themselves. He didn't try to protect her from rooms she'd already learned to dominate. She didn't try to shrink his fire to make space for her own. They walked into meetings as equals, as co-architects of something bigger than either name on the contract. Still, there were moments outside the noise. A shared bottle of whiskey after midnight over scattered spreadsheets. A drive through empty farmland with the windows down, their laughter trailing behind them like a flag. Mornings when her coffee was already on the table because he'd remembered how she took it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Amara realized she was no longer moving through life with a wound she had to hide. She was moving with someone who didn't just see her strength. He matched it, challenged it, held it steady when the world tilted. The turbines turned. The new project grew roots. And something else, something quieter, but just as powerful, grew with it. Love, built not on rescue or need, but on choice, on respect, on the quiet certainty that this time, she was building everything, career, heart, future, on her own terms. The blow didn't land all at once. It arrived like a hairline fracture, invisible at first. A headline buried halfway down an industry newsletter. A whisper in a boardroom that didn't belong to her. A subtle pause in a client's voice where once there had been trust. And then, as with all carefully orchestrated attacks, the crack widened fast. Southwind's rapid expansion raises concerns about conflicts of interest, the article read. Sources question whether Amara Johnson's personal relationship with tech investor Nathaniel Whitmore has created an unfair advantage in securing major contracts. No names were attached to the sources. There never are when the knife is meant to slip in clean. By mid-afternoon, 3 clients had requested clarification meetings. By evening, one had pulled $12 million from the fund. Sterling and Hayes' compliance office sent her a curt calendar invite. Internal review, mandatory attendance. Amara stared at the email as rain streaked the windows of her office. The skyline blurred into itself. This wasn't a scandal born of accident. It was strategy, precision. Someone had decided to remind her that no matter how far she'd climbed, they still believed they could yank the ladder out from under her. And she knew exactly who. William Langford had never forgiven her for thriving without him, for building something real after he'd tossed her aside like an inconvenient chapter in his perfect legacy. She'd seen his name crop up in whisper chains for weeks now, polite society's version of trench warfare. But this wasn't just personal. This was a counterattack. She paced the length of her office, the silence pressing in like a second skin. She could almost hear him, that calm, polished voice of his. She's clever, yes, but we both know how she gets what she wants. They'd paint her as the stereotype they always wanted her to be, ambitious but manipulative, dangerous. The woman who seduced power instead of earning it. The fact that her track record was spotless didn't matter. Perception was currency, and William had grown up printing it. The next morning, the internal review room felt colder than usual. A paneled conference room, deliberately sterile. 3 senior partners sat across from her, faces arranged into masks of professional neutrality. Gerald sat at the corner, tight-lipped, avoiding her eyes. Ms. Johnson, the chair began, there have been concerns raised regarding potential conflicts of interest tied to your personal relationship with Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore. Amara kept her hands flat on the table. Concerns raised by whom? That's not relevant to this process, the woman replied smoothly, which meant it was very relevant, just untouchable. They asked about investment timelines, about shared projects, about Nate's role in the solar wind expansion deal. Each question was wrapped in velvet, but the blade beneath was sharp. Are you here because you're brilliant, or because a man likes you? Amara answered each question with precision. She cited compliance documents, timestamps, co-signatures. She reminded them, without raising her voice, that her fund had outperformed their traditional portfolios by double digits in less than a year. But she could feel it, the shift in the room. It wasn't about facts, it was about control. One of the partners leaned back, steepling his fingers. You understand, Miss Johnson, that even the perception of impropriety can harm the firm's reputation. Her pulse ticked hard against her throat. I understand that perception is exactly what people use when they can't touch reality. The man's expression didn't flicker. We're not your enemies. She met his gaze evenly. Then stop acting like it. The silence that followed wasn't victory. It was a line in the sand. The fallout spread fast. Industry blogs devoured the whispers. Anonymous Twitter accounts recycled them with hashtags. Clients called less. Some didn't call at all. Amara watched the numbers dip on her dashboard, small but sharp. The kind of tremor that could grow into a landslide if left unchecked. Nate found her on the rooftop of their office that night. The wind was sharp enough to bite through her coat, but she didn't feel it. She stood with her hands braced on the railing, staring at the city as if it were an opponent rather than a home. "They're saying it's because of me," he said quietly behind her. "It's not about you," she answered. "It's about making me small again." He stepped closer, the warmth of him cutting through the wind. "Then they've made a mistake." She turned to face him, anger flashing hot and clean. "William knows exactly how this game works, Nate. He doesn't need to prove anything. He just needs to stain me long enough to make people look away." Nate's jaw tightened. "Then we don't let him." "Don't say we," she said, voice low, sharp around the edges. "This war started with my name on the board. Not yours." He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "Then let me stand next to it." For the first time in weeks, she let the silence hold. Not in defeat, but in defiance. The next morning, another client pulled their money. Not because they believed the rumors, but because they didn't want to choose a side. That was worse. Fear spreads faster than lies. Amara stared at the glowing numbers on her monitor. This was her test. Not a breakup, not the sneers in ballrooms, not whispers about where she came from. This was the kind of trial that decided whether someone became a footnote or rewrote the chapter entirely. She closed her laptop. Her reflection stared back in the black screen. Not the girl they underestimated, not the woman they tried to shame. Someone forged in wind and fire. William Langford wanted to make her flinch. She was done flinching, and the next move would be hers. The press conference wasn't born in a polished boardroom or a billion-dollar tower. It began with a single sentence, written at 2:13 a.m. in the silence of Amara's apartment. "Power isn't borrowed, it's built." She read it 3 times before she hit send. The next morning, that sentence became the headline on a sleek white web page that carried a single name, Ascent Capital. The Langfords thought they'd cornered her. The rumors, the quiet withdrawals, the closed doors. It was supposed to make her retreat. Instead, it lit the fuse. Amara didn't deny the whispers. She buried them under something louder, bigger, unstoppable. A public launch, a new fund. Hers. The announcement came on a Thursday morning. Press invitations had gone out 48 hours earlier, shrouded in deliberate mystery. By the time she stepped onto the stage at the Field Museum's glass atrium, the room was packed with journalists, camera crews, analysts, the kind of crowd that smells blood or glory and doesn't care which. She wore a black tailored suit, no jewelry, no distractions, just her name, her voice, and the wind at her back. Nate stood just off stage, not as a savior, not as a shield, as a partner, equal. "Good morning," she began, voice steady, the microphone catching the steel under her calm. "Some of you have read stories about me. Some of them are true, some of them are fiction. Today, I'm telling you mine." She didn't defend herself. She didn't beg for credibility. She spoke about infrastructure, energy transitions, underestimated regions, and the future they could build if they stopped waiting for permission. And then, she delivered the blow no one saw coming. "As of today, I am leaving Sterling and Hayes to launch Ascent Capital, a fund dedicated to energy innovation and community-driven growth. Nate Whitmore has joined as co-founder. Our initial assets under management, $180 million, and we're just getting started." For a breathless second, the room went still. Then the flashbulbs erupted like fireworks. The narrative flipped overnight. She wasn't a woman under investigation. She was a woman walking away from an empire she'd outgrown to build her own. The headlines were relentless. "A Black woman reshapes energy finance. Ascent Capital launches with record commitment. Amara Johnson, from underdog to industry force. They didn't frame her as the ex-girlfriend anymore. They framed her as a storm.